I think the carbon market right now is very focused on generating a ton of carbon for some sort of compensatory claim, which is okay. But that means that the only discussion we're having in carbon markets is, are we achieving a ton of carbon? I think we need to balance that out with the theory of change around what it is that we're using with the finance that's being delivered to enable the kinds of economic transitions that the world really needs to reduce costs, build distribution and maintenance networks, to de-risk future investments in these technologies and practices. And so I think there's some work that we need to do to enable those kinds of transitions.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome to Scenes from the IETA North America Climate Summit 2024 in New York City, a special episode of Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Smarter Markets returned to the Carbon Market Studio at the IETA North America Climate Summit 2024 to take stock of where we are and what we need to do next to harness the power of markets to make net zero possible. We partnered with IETA to interview a cross-section of conference participants to understand where they see the opportunities and the challenges for using carbon markets to support climate action, and the most important developments they are following in the carbon markets now. We've compiled a selection of those 11 interviews into this special episode of Smarter Markets. If you would like to listen to the full interviews, they're available on our websites, smartermarkets.media, on the Smarter Markets Presents media page. They're also available on our second podcast channel, Smarter Markets Presents, available on all major podcast platforms. Our guests in order of appearance in this episode are Alfredo Nicastro, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Carbon Markets at StoneX. Sandeep Roy Chowdhury, Director at V&V Advisory. Svenja Telly, CEO at Denominator. Hugh McAlpine, Partner, GS Environmental. Peter Zaman, Partner, HFW Singapore. Alex Sire, CEO at Cercobano. Sandra Pinzon, Founder and CEO at Global Zero Waste. Juan Duran, CEO, Eco Registry. Steve Zwick, Producer and Host, Bionic Planet. Yvonne Champagne, Chief Carbon Officer, Carbon AI. David Antonioli, Owner of Transition Finance. We hope you enjoyed these scenes from the IETA North America Climate Summit 2024. Alfredo Nicastro, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Carbon Markets at StoneX.
This is a very important week, right? So Climate Week is a very important week. So the IETA event is one of the milestone events where we meet with peers, come not only to this event, but also all of the other side events that we have opportunity to talk to market players, to potential buyers, or to fintech companies that are innovating in our industry. I think it's mostly to connect with our peers, to continue growing our business. And of course, since we are a global company, financial services, we're always looking for innovating and providing additional solutions to our clients. So this is a great week with a very diverse audience where we can basically tap into different minds and opportunities. A lot of conversation, discussion, as you would expect, about what is to come on VCM, expectations about Baku. I don't have too many, to be honest with you. I think major decisions are going to come probably in Brazil, in Belém. That's also something that I've been hearing consistently this couple of days. Very interesting discussions also on supply chain and scope 3. So we're starting to see more and more in setting discussions or climate smart commodity discussions, and people starting to look at our carbon markets more as a matter of risk management rather than an opportunity, right? So if you manage your risk properly, you may eventually monetize your climate action. So I've seen several things around that. So far, so good.
And that's interesting, the idea of looking at carbon markets as a risk management tool as opposed to an opportunity. In your role at StoneX, how does that change what people are looking to you for?
StoneX is a commodities company. We do a lot of risk management for other commodities. Carbon for us is just another asset class, right? So we have over 54,000 institutional and commercial clients that have exposure to carbon markets, either because they're regulated or because they have voluntary commitments. Many of them don't understand what are the potential impacts, risks, and opportunities. So they come to us typically to ask us for help on that end, either because someone is knocking on their doors, say, look, you have a potential asset I can help you develop, and you can make this amount of money by selling it, or because they hear a lot about regulations that may impact their business. Well, I can give an example. We have some of our metals clients approaching us, concerned about CBAM. How can I manage my exposure to EUAs, to the EU market right now, and in anticipation for the CBAM regulation, which is ineffective to them, but it starts applying in early 2026. So we see a difference in the marketplace today. Companies actually more concerned about tackling their Scope 3 emissions because some of the international buyers or food companies, for example, may eventually not buy your product in a couple of years if you don't comply with certain carbon intensity requirements. So it's changing a bit in the sense that people really seeing that as a risk topic that needs to be managed. So since we are exposed to those commodity markets, we are getting a lot of inquiries about that. I think all the scrutiny that we have seen in the past 2 years around the structure of the carbon markets as we know it so far, right, has been a little bit unfair, I would say, in certain aspects. Of course, I'm very pro in strengthening transparency, integrity, and quality of the assets we generate through the carbon market mechanisms. I think also I'm a bit concerned that we won't be able to get to our goals only by regulation. With the policies that we have implemented, with the NDCs as we have them right now, we may get to 2.7 centigrades. So we need increased ambition from countries, but we also need voluntary action. We're going to need to fill in that gap with voluntary action. So we need more clarity for investors. They're willing to put money down to invest in mitigation initiatives. They're going to produce the necessary emission reductions or the capture, right, the carbon removals. We need more clarity for the investors to put money down and invest in those projects. I'm really hoping that in Baku, we're going to see some resolutions around Article 6 that is going to help a bit. Also, I think SBTI and other initiatives have to figure out Scope 3 emissions. Can we use offsets or not? And to which extent? So companies have a more clarity when they're setting up their decarbonization strategies. So I think this is critical for voluntary carbon markets mostly. First is a resolution on Article 6 once and for all, understand how it impacts our markets. And second is understand how eventually changes to SBTIs and other mechanisms out there will affect our ability to decarbonize using offsets.
Sandeep Roy Chowdhury, Director at V&V Advisory.
It's the markets. It's the place where I think buy side meets the supply side. And that's, I think, very, very important. Because as a supply side, we do not get to see too much of the buyer fraternity in the regions that we come from. So New York becomes this melting pot of financiers, of buyers, and of guys like me, so who are trying to sell their wares.
And how has it been on the supply side?
Supply side has been challenging because of various reasons. One is obviously the enhanced scrutiny on the markets, enhanced scrutiny on the robustness of carbon accounting. So obviously it's been a bit challenging with standards upping their requirements. It's not always easy to keep transitioning from a project design to the stage. And so it's been challenging, to say the least, actually. But yeah, I guess it's for the better for the markets. But we all need to get in line and get it sorted out once again. Happy to do it.
And how do you find the mood among the demand side this year?
I think it is a lot better than last year. And it makes me hopeful. A bit more optimism has come in, I think, because there are some signals being sent by the bigger buyers that we are in this for the long haul. And that's the key word for the long haul, because the kind of projects that we work in on the nature space, they are not very short term. So it was always not that challenging to find spot credit buyers, but to really look at companies which are looking at a strategic kind of carbon investment and offtake arrangements. That seems to be the flavor of this week. And it's a great start. I think people are starting to talk about it, which is a good thing. Let's hope that this actually culminates into something more concrete in the future.
Where do you see some of the big opportunities for the supply side over the next few years?
I'm a big believer in least developed countries and emerging countries using carbon finance as social capital, and that's been my work and a lot of other people's work as well. So I think what hopefully will happen is there is going to be greater recognition within these countries that carbon markets are a good source of finance. It is not debt, it's not equity, it's not a grant. So it's a very, very essential form of finance, especially for the emerging countries. So I'm hoping that there will be more innovation. The supply side is going to unlock itself because these countries are geared towards supply. We've seen that before. As long as there's a demand signal, the supply side will show up, and that is good for the planet and for people. So I think there's a huge potential for new entrants to the carbon market. We're not talking about the legacy entrants. You had India, China, and Brazil, for example, show up. I think in the next 2.0 that we're looking at least 50 to 60 countries participating in the markets, which is a great thing for the markets. I mean, that's more democratization of the markets, and I think that's where the market should be heading. I'm quite excited.
Where do you see some of the big challenges over the next year?
One of the challenges is defining what is high quality. I think we're living in a world where we don't really understand that much. We keep saying high integrity, high quality. What is that? And I think everybody has their own interpretation of what is high quality and what is high integrity. And that is a problem because you have to standardize that quality at some point, which is why I'm very excited about the work that ICVCM is doing. With some kind of label, let's say, okay, if I have a CCP label, that means that I meet the threshold quality parameters, and that should then be considered a quality project. If you leave too much to interpretation on every company deciding what is good or what is bad, and I think that's a big challenge. And that we're seeing today as we speak. And I think for the markets at large, we need to sort this out once and for all, because otherwise we'll be in a constant circus of what is quality.
And speaking of the future, are there any developments or like a development that you're going to be following over the next year? That's the most important.
One is the Article 6 negotiations. I mean, talk about compliance or voluntary at some way or the other. This has an influence on voluntary markets, and I think them deciding on the rules is going to give a fillip to the markets in general and not just for the compliance markets. So I am really looking forward to that. And number two is what I'm looking forward to, what I just mentioned in the challenges, is to start to just standardize quality. So these are the two challenges.
Sven Yatelli, CEO at Denominator.
A couple of months ago, I kicked off Denominator with a wonderful team of co-founders. And we are really focused on utilizing data to address financing barriers in climate technology. So the big picture idea here is to create something we call MRV 2.0, where we deploy trusted data in use cases that are relevant for carbon markets, for industrial insetting, and for reporting compliance across ESG and regulatory frameworks.
And when you talk about data, what sort of information are people actually wanting or needing to capture?
That's a good question. So we really work bottom up. We see a lot of rating agencies in the market that really work top down in terms of what sort of data is available to them. We think about it in a way that we work with project developers on the ground. We have two deployment methodologies or deployment schemes on the ground. The first one is where we deploy our own sensors in the project. In fact, we're going to launch our first product in October, where we're going to demonstrate that use case with a fully independent sensor MRV system in the project that is then channeled through a data digestion framework into a user front end, a typical SaaS product. Here, the interesting differentiator to traditional MRV, where data was used from the project developers, is that it's fully independent, which opens up new use cases to de-risk the project by bringing in insurance sector. And the long-term goal is really to reduce the capital costs of the project.
So when you look forward, like with your new business, the new venture, what you're hearing about AI, what do you see as some of the big opportunities and challenges for the carbon markets over the next few years?
Opportunities and challenges. I think applications for AI and MRV, a lot of projects in carbon markets, especially on the technology side, technology and engineered removals, we've seen a lot of venture capital flowing into technology development. But right now, these projects sit at the verge of facing the valley of death, to be dramatic, between venture capital and growth capital. And filling that gap, you really need tools that allow risk transferability for the investor of their balance sheet. That's insurance. And a lot of insurers don't understand those technologies. So bringing in a tool that helps insurers to produce something like technology risk performance for these projects makes investors with lower capital costs more comfortable to invest in these novel technologies. If you think about that for the engineered side of the carbon market, it's key to have projects that are commercial scale in order to produce carbon credits. So here you see a sort of a dog biting its own tail. And we are hoping through data to syndicate the supply out of these engineered removal projects into carbon markets, but also in the broader carbon management scheme around what I mentioned earlier, e-fuels and other decarbonization verticals.
Hugh McAlpine, partner, GS Environmental.
GS Environmental is a proprietary trading firm. We spend a lot of time thinking about risk and how it can be distributed in different places, sort of different benefit. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about hedging strategies, products that might provide interesting ways to manage some of the risks associated with these markets. More specifically, I've been seeking out and having discussions around potentially different index type structures where we can distribute risks across a variety of markets or a variety of individual projects in a VCM context, and in that way more effectively manage our own risk, potentially attract new capital and scale these markets in a way that is meaningful. Our founding premise is that carbon markets over a long enough timescale will ultimately converge. In the shorter term, it's about getting the appropriate policy frameworks in place to create the momentum for that convergence. And so what we see sort of more immediately is compliance markets incorporating voluntary components, incorporating renewable energy type product. And so at this sort of crux, we see quite a lot of opportunity to generate returns, but also to provide liquidity. A lot of what we do as a market making firm is provide liquidity in places perhaps where liquidity doesn't exist, or it exists in a sort of patchy type fashion. And so using or sitting at that crux of newer voluntary, often driven markets, or perhaps new compliance type environments is something that is really attractive to us, with the intention or the hope that markets ultimately sort of converge to a significant extent. I don't think we'll have one sort of global carbon price, but ultimately it would be nice to have fewer rather than more.
Are there certain topics or issues that you're looking forward to discussing this year?
I think that all eyes are on how corporate emissions reporting guidelines are set up. I think that as those policy settings perhaps are built and ripple through markets, we find that particularly interesting. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer, certainly in voluntary markets, that new policy drives parabolic changes in activity, where in actual fact, it happens slowly. Rome wasn't built in a day. It takes time and consistency with these policies to ripple through different markets. And it's about being there, I think, seeing those opportunities and ultimately responding to how people are interpreting that policy and whether or not we agree with it.
Always in carbon markets, there's the concerns about quality and integrity. You're a market maker having to think about pricing all different types of carbon offsets and carbon credits. I was curious, how do you think about the quality spectrum?
I think that technology ultimately will help us to solve some of these issues. And I think that people are really important to this discussion as well. It's about looking at particular projects and the teams that are associated with them and how they understand the inherent risks associated with the product that they're looking to build. But ultimately, I think the policy settings just need to get to a point where it's good enough to create momentum and ultimately build from there. And I think as a firm, we're confident that takes place. I think more specifically, we use technology and ultimately the experience to try and understand whether or not quality is priced appropriately. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, and what we've seen historically in carbon is that price is the best indicator of quality in some but not all contexts. And perhaps in projects in the voluntary context that have sold off really heavily, perhaps quality lies there too. And so it's about taking the time and trying not to get absorbed in sort of a broader discussion or a broader negativity and try to find what quality looks like perhaps where others are not looking.
I'd like to ask you one more question before I let you get back to the conference. And that's, is there any one development that you're going to be following most closely in the coming year?
I spend a lot of time looking at Corsia. I think there'll be a lot of keen eyes on how ICAO and the TAB assess new programs and whether or not they include new programs into that sort of broader ICAO set of approved registries or standards. And then things like biennial transparency reports, how countries are sort of interpreting Paris guidance. Because ultimately, we see Corsia as a pioneer or a framework in a broader Article 6 type world. And it's largely a test of whether these programs can work. And I think that's particularly interesting to us and what we'll be spending a lot of time on top of keeping an eye on how these foundations are being built in a voluntary context.
Peter Zaman, partner, HFW, Singapore. What did you come to talk about this year at IETA?
Actually, it's the first time I'm ever coming to the North American Climate Week, so I've heard a lot about it. I've heard as well that a lot of the action takes place in the IETA forum, so hence I'm here. But in reality, I'm here because I'm not going to Baku. So, the practical reality is that when it comes to your choice of how you develop your BD budget, I think the question is, why would I go to Baku or why would I come here? I decided that Baku isn't really going to be that productive. That's my expectation in terms of how things will turn out. And therefore, I felt that the more useful thing to do would be come here and feel the vibe when it comes to US climate policy. Because there is a real challenge, I feel, coming up, particularly in the context of Paris Agreement negotiations, where the US's position on certain policy issues will be quite important. And we do have a very important election coming up just around about the same time as Baku. And therefore, the coincidence of those two dates mean that there's a real question mark around what position the US adopts come negotiations in Baku. And it's almost a toss of a coin, given the closeness of where the election is. So I came here to get a better vibe for what would happen in either of the two scenarios that would follow from the outcome of the elections and what that meant for the rest of the world. So I do think the outcome of the US election, it has a material effect on what we take away and benefit from by way of the outcome of Article 6. Also, in terms of the way US policy and European policy on climate differs. I've often, in conversations we've had previously on the podcast, described sort of the Inflation Reduction Act as a bit more of a carrot approach compared to the European approach, which is much more of a stick. So I do see that carrot and stick contrast has policy implications that put the US and the EU at loggerheads. And therefore, whether or not the EU have loggerheads in a pro-climate way or have loggerheads in an anti-climate way is really the outcome of what the election will determine. But one way or the other, the US and the EU are at loggerheads when it comes to policy.
And for people thinking about the election, which you said, it's still a coin flip. So when you're thinking about how do you manage risk if you're someone who's going to be active in carbon markets, trying to follow their own decarbonization agenda, and you're looking at this fork in the road, how would you advise people to think about those two scenarios?
I think the difference that you get from the choice of the policy outcomes is reflected ultimately at some point in national legislation. So you only have to look at what's happened in the EU with its Green Deal legislative framework, which mostly got introduced before the last European Parliament, but is now being implemented by the current European Parliament. And actually, the current implementing Parliament has a choice as to whether or not they go all in or they start rolling back a little bit. And actually, the message we're getting from the EU is that they are all in. So what you're going to get is implementation on steroids. And implementation on steroids mean that even things that are not necessarily completely ironed out are going to be steamrolled through, and therefore they're going to leave the market having to figure out how to live with the consequences. We've seen that happen before, and it's never pretty, and the market always pays the price. And so I anticipate, at least from an EU perspective, a lot more of that. I think for the rest of the world, and I include the US in that, for the rest of the world, the question is always going to be, well, I hear the tune you are playing, but do I want to dance to that tune? And I think the choice of whether or not the rest of the world dances to that tune is very much going to depend on trade flows. And I think it's a real shift in trade flows that I anticipate happening over the course of the next 4 years, very much influenced by the outcome of the US elections, but also influenced by the way in which the EU have positioned themselves as requiring commodities and the supply chain to dance to a certain type of tune. And the real question is, does the rest of the world, in the way in which they have to meet the requirements for EU market access, accept that and take it on the chin? And I think that's the interesting thing that will play out in the next 4 years. So if I was advising clients who are in the commodity space, or I was advising clients who are looking at trade flows, the answer is always going to be, you've got to follow the policy drivers because they influence the investment that you put in today, for which there's a couple of years of investment return that you have to minimum think about. So if you don't have a 5-year, 10-year horizon, forward-looking horizon on how you're actually going to convert your investment into returns, and you don't anticipate the climate policy influence on that, then I think you are not doing your job properly.
We've seen the US and Europe kind of aligning, trying to wrest some control over critical minerals away from China. When you're thinking about trade, is it around these commodities that are critical to decarbonization, or is it just a much broader realignment and kind of a rethinking of free trade?
The decarbonization agenda ultimately goes back to becoming a critical minerals and a supply chain agenda. And actually, China's got a head start on everybody on that. So we are going to see a lot of trade-related attempts to try and counterbalance China's head start. Basically, the rest of the world wants to penalize China for having foresight, right? And it's okay if that's the way you want to play it and that's what you want to do, and you can only punish yourself for your own lack of foresight. What are you going to do? That's kind of the way in which all the trade war and tariff wars are ultimately playing out. But when it comes to the carrot and stick distinction, and you're a producer or a supplier who's not in the EU and not in the US, your choices as to where you therefore supply become very much dependent on whether or not you're waving a stick at the person or whether or not you're giving them a carrot. And I think that's where the difference in climate policy becomes very important to supply chains.
Alex Sire, CEO at Cercarbano.
You don't often see standards, in fact, from the developing world. You always see standards from Europe, from US, from other countries that are really wealthy countries. Since we come from Latin America, that makes us pretty different. You may know that Latin America has a really big potential and has many projects ongoing, nature-based projects. So we are a standard that we are in the field. We really know what these projects on the field. We really understand the context of the people, of the local communities, of project developers that are working on the field. And we know also the hurdles and the bottlenecks that the project developers suffer when they try to get their project done. As Cercarbano, we have like a pretty distinctive approach. We have close communication with project developers and BBBs during the certification process. We have like a really personal interaction with them in order to get the process more smoothly and get many touching points during the certification process. You don't feel, or project developers doesn't feel, that they are sending the projects to a black box. They feel that there is someone who's leading the process. As Latin American, we really put a lot of attention on personal interaction. So you will find that in Cercarbano, that someone is really leading the projects that are being certified under Cercarbano. We are right now working in another tool. We call it like the financial transparency tool, in order to get the project developers disclose how the benefits from the projects are being distributed into the communities and local communities and indigenous people. that are being involved in the projects. So that will give a lot of transparency to the market, will give a lot of quality to the projects, which will translate into more integrity. We have our own approach on some of these methodologies. Everyone knows that the market has been suffering from some negative news, but I think most of the projects are really good quality projects. We have been constantly working, and I'm sure not only Ser Carbono, but all the standard has been constantly working in order to build more integrity into the whole process. And I think this is a continuous improvement that you have to do it in order, because the quality changes over time. What it was good 5 years ago, it may be not good right now. Some things that are at that time were developed at that time were pretty innovative, everyone accepted, but right now, no. And that's a consequence of the evolution of the market and the increases expectations that the client has into the market. And that's a good thing. We need to continue improving. For example, in our case, last June, we launched our first project that was certified by Ser Carbono that had the credits insured by a warranty and indemnity insurance. It was the first Afolu project worldwide to have their credits insured by Howden, which is a pretty important broker from the UK. And that's the kind of solutions that we need to bring to the market.
Sandra Pinzon, founder and CEO at Global Zero Waste.
What do we aim for? We aim to use these plastic credits for companies that want to offset their plastic footprint. For example, in the tech world, we have a lot of plastics that are not being recycled. If I ask you what percentage of your cell phone is made of plastic materials, you might say a certain amount in grams, but who is offsetting that footprint in the end? There are extended producer responsibility programs, but they are insufficient. Where does this insufficiency show up? Or where are these externalities, which we call them, leading to pollution? It's because more than 430 million tons of plastic are produced annually worldwide, and only 9% is recycled. So, where is the missing 81%? Resources are lacking, and we believe that through this financial instrument, we can incorporate or attract new resources for plastic transformation processes globally. We face a new pedagogy in the world of environmental financial assets markets. The main challenge is knowledge. This is why we, together with Ser Carbono, are promoting the first course for structuring circular economy projects for plastic materials. It has been very well received, with more than 700 students from over 38 countries worldwide. We have worked with UN Habitat to promote our course on the WasteWise Cities platform, and it has been very successful. We believe that more knowledge is needed, and as a non-governmental organization, Global Zero Waste is promoting this course. Additionally, we must overcome many barriers, one of which is reaching all audiences, all stakeholders in the plastic value chain. And to this end, we are working precisely so that all the economic sectors involved can have access to this knowledge. What is the future? We have understood that programs like ours are needed to unify the language and dialogue between all stakeholders. Within our set of programs, we have the Voluntary Circular Economy Program, the Zero Waste Management Systems Program, and Zero Waste Event Recognitions. In the future, we want to consolidate our methodologies, such as the plastic recycling methodology for issuing credits with other material streams. And the most controversial one at this moment is plastic. But in the future, we could be linking other materials. However, these are markets that are maturing, that are emerging, and with the plastic cup, as we call it, We know that the market for this material will be greatly boosted because it is urgent for the planet to provide a solution to microplastics, especially because of water contamination.
Juan Duran, CEO, Eco Registry.
This year has been very good because I believe the market is transforming itself from, let's say, a project-based market to a more like information data-driven market where we share more information from the projects, the attributes of every single unit. And for that, you need an infrastructure capable of communicating all those registries to exchanges and giving away the information clear and transparent. And that's what we're here for.
And how does Eco Registry contribute to that process for people who aren't familiar with what you're doing?
At Eco Registry, we are a registration platform. So we work with different crediting programs so that the process, the workflow in the validation, verification, and issuance of the process is very clear and all the stakeholders can interact in the same platform so that the information is traceable. So that's the first step, like safeguarding all the information that supports the evidence or the evidence that supports the issuance of every single unit. That's very important. And we give it away in a very clear format so that anybody can see it. And then afterwards, the accounting system of every single unit. So once the units are issued, then we control transfers, retirements, and connection to exchanges. And giving that as well, again, traceable and transparent is very important for the market. To be honest, coming from a developing country myself, it has been always my work, like communities, project developers, people that are actually doing the projects on the field really have fast access to the market, clear, transparent, and with the best possibilities to the market. Purpose why I'm here, one of the purposes is talking to all the buyers in the market, understanding the needs, how they want the information to be displayed, what are the attributes of every single unit that they want to see, so that I can make it clear and transparent to everybody, so I can help more financing flow to those projects that really need it.
And what do the buyers want to see? Anything that's surprising or new?
They need to understand what they can be using the unit for. For example, like eligibility criteria, like for example, is this a unit being accepted in this specific carbon market? Right now, there are a lot of carbon markets in the world, like you have the Egyptian carbon tax. In Querétaro, Guanajuato, different states in Mexico have carbon taxes, Colombia, Chile. Singapore has also carbon tax. One decision point is, what can I use this unit for? CORSIA is coming as well, so those kind of decision makers are very important. And also the attributes of how has been this unit originated, like nature-based solutions, technology-based solutions. Is it a specific technology that they are using, like, I don't know, landfill gas, methane capture, like those kind of attributes? That's what they want to see very clear.
And when you look out, and think about the opportunities and challenges facing the carbon markets over the next year, what are some of those?
I see the challenge, or I would say also an opportunity, is we need to digitize the market more, like make it available for all this information that I'm talking about, all the attributes about the project to be exchanged between different platforms so that decision makers can actually make more informed decisions, so data-driven decisions. It means that they have all the information at their disposal, at their display, so that they can make the right decision at the right time. That will give access to the market, to the financial sector. That will also give access to insurances to come. And people like to invest in things that they are insured.
Just thinking ahead to the coming year, are there certain developments or a development in the carbon market that you're going to be following that you think is an important one to watch?
I'm very expectant of the CORSIA market. And also, there are a lot of new crediting programs appearing in the world. In my head counts, there are around 80 of them. So competitors to Veras, to Gold Standards, to Climate Action Reserve, to Ser Carbono, they are coming all over the world. So I see a market that is fragmented, or I don't like the word fragmented. I heard that yesterday. I like the word decentralized. So decentralized markets will give more opportunities to implement on the ground, but we need to find a way of interconnecting all those decentralized markets. And that's the challenge.
Steve Zwick, producer and host, Bionic Planet.
I feel like we still have this huge disconnect between the reality of what's happening here, what's happening in the COP, and public discourse, how it's perceived out there, how it's discussed out there. And I'm still really concerned that people here are moving along. They're trying to address really complicated issues in a way that is scientifically sound. And they continue to think that if they just keep moving forward, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, adapting as they go along, everything is going to be fine. And I'm still concerned that they're going to get torpedoed if they don't pay attention to how things are perceived outside this arena.
And how do you think things are being perceived right now? Or what's the risk?
I think the perception is that the markets were a big mistake. This is when you talk to people, there's a perception that the voluntary carbon market especially just emerged one day, was concocted by the oil industry to avoid taking action, and that people woke up and realized, oh, it's a disaster, it's shake and bake, it's smoke and mirrors, and now let's bring some meat into it. That's the perception, is that it was broken and now it's being fixed. Whereas the reality is that if you go back to 20 years ago, especially in red, avoided deforestation, going back to the very start, the idea was, okay, we got all this modeling that was done, the IPCC evaluated it. The whole discussion was, we know what seems to work. We also know we don't have enough data. We know we need more data to really make it rock solid, but we have enough. How can we create a system that will take what we have, give us a reasonable expectation of success, and then adapt over time? And embedded in that was a reevaluation after 10 years. Embedded in that was also the idea that you're going to have conservative baselining and that you're going to ignore potential positive externalities, which are things that they didn't even try to quantify. Now, as the data was becoming available and people were realizing this works, this doesn't, certain people, as we know, took what didn't work out of context, made it look like the whole thing was a sham, which it was not. It never was. The voluntary market, it's voluntary. It's not meant to carry the whole load. It's meant to take us above and beyond what's required by law and to test new methodologies, and exceeded in both of those. And I feel like now, with this narrative out there that, okay, they started wrong and now they're on the right track, the same thing is going to happen, because we're still moving towards, yes, you've got some methodologies where the data is there. It's going to be more solid, but you've got other elements of the voluntary market that are still going to have uncertainties and still need to be funded. There are going to be imperfections. And unless the market makes it clear to people that this is all, the entire climate challenge is a learn by doing exercise, it's going to be, ideologues are going to still come in at some point and cherry pick and make it look like the whole thing is what they said it was before, which it wasn't.
And before I let you go, I wanted to ask you, you started the conversation saying that if we don't learn how to tell this complex story in a better, more convincing way, the markets are setting themselves up to be torpedoed again. I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the issue that could be the next big risk for getting torpedoed? And if we tell the story right, what's the opportunity?
There is a difference between themes and stories. We need them both. And one big theme is this theme of uncertainty, because everything we deal with in life is we're constantly making decisions based on imperfect information. You can make the right decision and suffer a bad consequence, and you can make a wrong decision and get lucky. But are you making the right decisions over time based on the information you have, and how are you dealing with uncertainty? I've just found when I talk to people about uncertainty in the markets, using an example like a batting average in baseball, if someone's a baseball fan, the best hitters in the world bat 400, but that means they're out 6 out of 4 times. But we still consider them the best. And we know that consistency is what we're looking for. In these markets, it's the same thing. We're dealing with models. We're dealing with uncertainty. We are adapting over time. And as we get more data, we become more and more certain, more and more precise. People do get that.
Yvonne Champagne, Chief Carbon Officer, Carbon AI.
To me, if I think about a carbon instrument of some sort, it's all about the data. We're dealing with something that's synthetic. It's not like a physical commodity where you're trading something that people can see, feel, and touch. So when we think about an emission reduction, that is something that, in many respects, it is about the data that makes it real. And if you have bad data that doesn't support the claims that you're making, you really don't have anything. And if there's anything that, if we look at market signals, what the market's been telling us for the last year and a half is people have lost confidence in the integrity of the emission reductions. And so if you want to have stronger markets that are going to scale, you need to build it on a better platform of data. For us, when we think about data integrity, it is about making sure that everything is auditable. That's how you ensure integrity. So every data point, kind of the tools that we build really focus on three things: being able to geolocate, timestamp, and user authenticate each data point that you are collecting so you can trace everything back to the source and ensure that the claims that you're making can be substantiated. I think what we're really seeing right now is there will be a very big shift to metered projects or for methodologies that haven't traditionally been metered, like modeled project types. You're going to need to get as close as possible to metered like. Implementing tools like this, you can really make that story more concrete and real.
And as you collect more and more data from these, what do you see the opportunity is once we have that broader visibility?
Well, I think that's going to be, the next frontier of how we bring in machine learning for us, predictive modeling, and being able to understand how can we learn from what is happening out in the field to deploy better technology, make stuff more efficient, make better products. Without data, it's really hard to do that sometimes. So if you have really good data that you can then apply some machine learning on and say, actually, by doing this, we might actually be able to reduce emissions by another 2 tons per year, just pull out a number. But if you multiply that across 20 million cook stoves, that's real, right? That's a big impact. So I'm pretty excited about the potential for that.
David Antonioli, owner of Transition Finance.
I spent the last year basically thinking and reflecting on the carbon markets. And I put together a report about how, basically setting out my reflections and my thoughts. But basically, the main message is that we can and should be using carbon finance as a driver and a catalyst to enable the kinds of transitions the world really needs. And quite frankly, I don't think we're right there. I think the carbon market right now kind of is very focused on generating a ton of carbon for some sort of compensatory claim, which is okay. But that means that the only discussion we're having in carbon markets is, are we achieving a ton of carbon? I think we need to balance that out with the theory of change around what it is that we're using with the finance that's being delivered to enable the kinds of economic transitions that the world really needs to reduce costs, build distribution and maintenance networks, to de-risk future investments in these technologies and practices. And so I think there's some work that we need to do to enable those kinds of transitions. And that's what I've been working on and trying to put together some ideas and some concrete proposals for how we do that.
When you come to a conference like this one, do you feel like those conversations are getting on the agenda, or are you trying to put them on the agenda?
I'm trying to put them on the agenda. Quite frankly, I don't think the market has broadly thought about this question. What drove it was this question. It was kind of one of those, wake up in the middle of the night wondering, what are we doing here? And the concern I have is, what's the plan for when the party ends? And what I mean by that is, like, when the last carbon credit is issued and sold, what then? How do we know that the activities that we've been financing through the sale of carbon credits actually generate some sort of long-term economic or structural transition or framework that enables those technologies or practices to keep going without the need for carbon finance? So that's a real big worry. And when I come to conferences like this, I'm putting it on the agenda, and it is a bit uncomfortable. Quite frankly, I get people who say, well, good question, but we'll come out later. We can work on that later. I get others who say, like, well, it's not my problem. And others who say, well, today I sell carbon credits, tomorrow I can sell biodiversity credits. I don't think that's a robust enough answer. And I actually think that we have a responsibility to really make sure that we're using this limited finance to drive those kinds of transitions. I think that opens up a whole different debate and narrative about what this market is about and what we're trying to achieve. We need to be forward-looking and set out a framework that identifies when carbon crediting is no longer appropriate. And then you let the market operate at scale with investment, and then investors can make big bets. So that's the idea of using finance to kind of get over that hump. And if you do that, then the farmer that goes to the local bank, right, says, can I get a loan to do some regenerative agriculture? The bank officer says, yeah, sure. I've seen David does it, and Jill does it, and Mary does it, and all the farmers around here are doing it. And the farms are in better position, right? They handled that last drought much better, right? So then it becomes a business opportunity. And that, to me, is where I think we need to go, and something that's really exciting about how we can use these markets to drive those kinds of transitions.
Yeah, that type of catalytic financing sounds really interesting to get you over that hump, as you put it, that's so difficult. And then this other piece you brought up about, almost like having a clock running on the additionality piece that, okay, we're going to need the financing until we get through that early adoption phase and you get past the tipping point. You spent a lot of time at Vera, you were the CEO. How do you think we need to adjust the way we think about the methodologies, the way we think about carbon markets to allow for that type of approach?
It's a great question. So I think that fundamentally, we need to reconsider the tool that we mostly use to approve projects, and that's the additionality tool. And quite frankly, I think the additionality tool has a lot of problems. And the additionality tool is like a test that you can take multiple times. And I'll bet you by the third time you take a test, you get 100. And so there's this constant back and forth that goes between the developer and the auditor and the developer and the standards body. And it's a lot of work. And quite frankly, I don't think it gets you that much integrity at the end of the day than if you just identified the activities that we know are not happening but are beneficial for the climate. Let's put those on a positive list. This has been done before. So think about California. California said, look, here are I think there's 7 activities that they've determined are additional a priori, and those get approved. Now, what California has not done is establish the point at which you no longer approve new projects. And that's where the key is. If we can find the appropriate threshold for those activities that have some sort of economic benefit, I think that's the key. Now, the other part to it is that carbon markets have been kind of trained to look at anything with an economic opportunity with extreme suspicion because it may not be additional. Well, actually, I think we're tying our hands behind our back because this is a race to try to get the new businesses. And I think carbon, the businesses of the future, I think carbon can do that. Other kinds of projects that don't have an economic rationale, like landfill gas capture and destruction, industrial emissions, even conservation of forests, don't have long-term economic value. So we need to think about mechanisms that ensure that those activities keep going, such as creating trust funds, for example, or getting government commitment. But we need to solve for that question, because if we don't, I do fear that we might end up implementing a lot of cool projects, but when the party ends, it's all going to come crashing down. And actually, it feeds into the criticism, right? A lot of people will argue that these markets are a distraction. And if we don't solve for this, I actually believe that they may have a point. So I think it's incumbent upon us that we really think about what the end game looks like to ensure that we're using this limited source of finance in a thoughtful and productive way.
Thanks again to all of our guests and to IETA for partnering with us at their North America Climate Summit 2024 in New York City. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to listen to the full interviews, they're available on our website, smartermarkets.media, on the Smarter Markets Presents media page. They're also available on our second podcast channel, Smarter Markets Presents, available on all major podcast platforms. We'll be back this Saturday morning with our regularly scheduled podcast. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.